Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. We toss words around all the time, but it's wild how much weight they can carry.
Right. Like sometimes you have those aha moments where you realize the impact language really had.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're tackling today, conscious language. And to help us unpack all of this, we're diving into Karen Yin's book, The Conscious Style Guide, a flexible approach to language that includes, respects, and empowers.
And that flexible approach is key. It's not about getting bogged down in strict rules, but finding a way to navigate the nuances of language, really considering how our words land.
Absolutely. And one thing I appreciate is how Yin dives right into the why, right from the get-go. Like, why even bother with all this? And that quote from the book, conscious language liberates instead of limits. It just says it all, really.
So powerful, right? It's about recognizing that language can be so much more than just getting it right. It's about using it as a tool to empower and include.
100%. And something that really got me thinking was her example of the terms survivor and victim. You might assume one is always the more empowering choice, but she points out how it's all about the individual's experience. Context matters.
It really does. And even the book's editor had a little moment with the title itself, wondering if flexible approach referred to the style guide or to language in general. It perfectly illustrates how the meaning we intend isn't always how it's received.
Like we each bring our own lens to how we understand things. Speaking of lenses, let's talk about implicit biases. This was huge for me in the planned chapter. It's kind of eye-opening and a little unnerving how these unconscious biases creep into our language without us even realizing it.
It's true, and it underscores why this work is so crucial. That example from the book about a man who was reported to the police just for being at a park with his child. It's a stark reminder of how these biases can have real-world consequences.
Oh my gosh, that one really got to me. It shows just how deeply ingrained these biases can be. It's a wake-up call for sure. But on a more encouraging note, I like how Yin brings up the idea of triaging language. Instead of aiming for this impossible standard of perfection, we can focus our energy on the areas where our words make the biggest impact. Seems way more sustainable.
Totally agree. It's about picking our battles and focusing on meaningful change. That's where those zoom levels come in. Word, sentence, story, and series, like looking at language under a microscope, starting small and then panning out to see the bigger picture.
I love that analogy. Okay, so let's zoom in on the word level first. That phrase, climate change deniers, comes to mind. I used to hear that everywhere, but reading Yin's take on it, I'm realizing how loaded it is.
It definitely carries a lot of baggage. And the book suggests sticking to more neutral descriptions, focusing on the facts. So instead of climate change deniers, maybe try people who don't agree with mainstream science. It just takes some of the heat out of the conversation.
It's amazing how subtle shifts can really change how we process information. And speaking of subtle shifts, the book also talks about striving for parity at the sentence level, like when we're describing people.
Oh, absolutely. Like if you're going to mention one person's appearance, aim for that same level of detail when you're describing others in the same context. Creates a better sense of balance.
And it makes you realize how often we default to certain ways of describing people without even noticing. But the example that totally blew my mind was about how we talk about historical events. Like instead of saying American women were granted the right to vote in 1920, Yin recommends white American women were granted the right to vote in 1920.
Such a small change, but what a difference it makes. It acknowledges a huge part of history that's often left out.
Right, it's about telling the whole story, not just a simplified version. Which actually reminds me of another term for the book, inspiration porn. Can you break that down a bit?
Yeah, inspiration porn, it's a bit of a loaded term, right?
Yeah.
It's about how we sometimes use images and stories of people with disabilities in a way that ends up objectifying them, using their experiences as a source of inspiration for non-disabled people.
Right, it's like they become this symbol instead of a person.
Yeah.
Like those pictures you see of someone with a disability overcoming some challenge, and it's meant to motivate everyone else. It's well-intentioned,
But it can miss the mark. And Yin stresses how important it is to move away from that kind of portrayal and instead create space for marginalized voices to share their own stories on their own terms.
Totally. It makes me think of that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie quote from the book, The Danger of a Single Story. Having a diversity of voices and experiences represented, especially in how we use language, is so important.
It really is. It's about actively seeking out those diverse voices and letting them disrupt the narratives we're used to hearing.
Okay, so how do we take all of this and make it real? Like, what happens when we're in those tricky conversations where we need to navigate conscious language on the fly? Those are the moments I tend to freeze up.
I hear you. Those can be tough. But Yin gives us some great tools in that pause chapter. Like, she acknowledges that putting all of this into practice can lead to some uncomfortable moments, but it doesn't have to be a recipe for disaster.
Okay, lay it on me. What are the key takeaways?
Curiosity is key. Instead of jumping to conclusions or getting defensive, try asking clarifying questions. Really listen to understand where the other person is coming from and assume good intentions, even if their language isn't perfect.
It's true. We're all coming from different places with this stuff. We're all at different points in our understanding of conscious language. And sometimes just meeting each other with a little grace can go a long way.
100%. It's a learning process for all of us, right?
Okay, so let's say we're trying to bring some of these ideas into a larger setting, like advocating for more conscious language at work. That can feel a little intimidating, to say the least.
Oh yeah, I've been there. But that Persuade chapter has some really helpful advice. One thing she talks about is pinpointing those influencers in a group. You know, the folks who have the power to create change or at least rally support.
Right. Find your people.
Exactly. And then when you're presenting your case, try to frame it in a way that connects to the values of your audience. Instead of just saying, this is the right thing to do, try to highlight how it benefits everyone.
So like instead of making it a moral issue, you show how it's practical too.
Yeah, exactly. Find that common ground. Show how using conscious language can make things clearer, more respectful, more inclusive. It can even make the workplace safer in some cases.
Right. It's about demonstrating those real-world benefits.
Totally. And I think that's a big part of what Yin is getting at throughout the book. Conscious language isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to adapt.
It's about progress, not perfection. Which kind of leads us to those really specific examples Yin gets into, like that section on dead names. I knew the term, but hadn't really grasped the weight of it before. It's more than just a preference, it's about respect. Right?
Absolutely. Using a transgender person's chosen name and pronouns, even when referring to their past, is so important. Dead naming can be incredibly invalidating and painful. Yin compares it to bleeping out a curse word or sensitive information, which I think is super insightful.
It really drives the point home. And it's interesting, this actually connects to a real-world example. The book mentions how this issue of respecting people's identities, even after they're gone, played a part in California passing the Respect After Death Act. It's a powerful illustration of why this matters.
It really shows how these seemingly small things, like using the right name or pronoun, can have a ripple effect.
Another example that kind of stopped me in my tracks was the part about capitalization, like why is black capitalized but not white? The book breaks it down in a way that just makes sense.
It's about consistency and respect, right? Yin talks about how capitalizing both black and white when referring to racial identity is a way of acknowledging their equal importance. It's a subtle but meaningful shift.
It really makes you think twice about those things we often take for granted.
Totally. And remember how she talks about how capitalization can help us distinguish between color and culture? Like lowercase black for the color, but capitalized black when we're talking about racial identity.
Oh, that's right. Just like using deaf with a capital D when referring to deaf culture.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those nuances.
Speaking of nuances, Yin also tackles that whole debate around the term Latinx. I know that's a tricky one. Some people love it, some people hate it. What's her take?
Yeah, she acknowledges the mixed feelings around it, but emphasizes that it originated within LGBTQ plus Latinx communities as a way to move beyond the gender binary. It's a good reminder that language often evolves within communities, so it's crucial to respect the agency of the folks who are directly impacted.
It's about understanding the context and listening to those whose lived experiences are reflected in the language.
Exactly. And that applies to how we approach all kinds of potentially problematic language, whether it's at the level of individual words or entire narratives.
So it's less about finding a one-size-fits-all solution and more about developing a deeper awareness of how language operates in different situations.
Right. And Yin gives a lot of great examples of that, like the phrase chink in the armor. It's a common idiom, but depending on the context, it can be really hurtful.
Right, especially if it's unintentionally juxtaposed with someone who might be harmed by that language.
And then there's slum. It's a word that carries so much baggage and often reinforces negative stereotypes about low-income communities.
Instead of relying on these kinds of loaded terms, Yin suggests using more neutral descriptions. It's about painting a more accurate and respectful picture.
And you can apply that same thinking to how we frame stories and narratives, like when we're talking about abuse, for instance. Yin encourages us to use active voice, so instead of, he was abused by his father, We say his father abused him. It shifts the focus from the victim to the perpetrator.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's subtle, but really powerful.
Right, and it's about being mindful of the language we're using even in those everyday conversations. Like instead of saying opposite sex, which implies this huge divide, maybe say different gender or another gender.
It's amazing how much those little tweaks can change the whole tone.
For sure. And Yin even gets into the nitty-gritty of interpersonal communication. Like,
Yeah.
how do you ask someone about their race, gender, or sexual orientation in a respectful way?
Oh man, those can be minefields.
I know, right? But she stresses the importance of being upfront about your intentions. Like, say something like, I'm asking because I'm trying to be more mindful of my language, or whatever feels genuine to you. And if someone's not comfortable answering, don't push it.
It's about respecting boundaries.
Totally. And sometimes, honestly, the best thing to do is just listen.
Especially in those heated moments. Sometimes saying nothing is the best move.
Absolutely. It's about knowing when to engage and when to step back, especially for your own well-being, which is another thing Yin emphasizes, taking care of yourself. This stuff can be emotionally taxing, so self-care is crucial.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed by it all.
For sure. And that's why I thought that whole section on emotional freedom techniques, or tapping, was so interesting.
That was new for me.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
It's basically a way to relieve stress and process difficult emotions through acupressure points. It might sound a little out there, but it can be really effective.
Huh, I'll check that out. It's wild how connected all of this is, right? Like our language choices, our well-being, it's all intertwined.
Totally. And speaking of connections, Yin also talks about the importance of documenting language, especially when we encounter problematic or offensive language.
That's such an interesting idea. Why is documentation so important?
It's like creating a historical record, you know? By tracking how language is used, we can see how it's evolved and how it continues to shape our perceptions. It's about holding ourselves and others accountable.
I like that. It's about acknowledging that language isn't static, it's always changing.
And that change can be messy and complicated. Like when it comes to organizations updating their names or materials to be more inclusive, sometimes there's a cost factor that gets in the way.
Right. Budget constraints and all that.
Exactly. And Yin acknowledges that reality, but she also encourages us to weigh that financial cost against the potential benefits of being more inclusive. It's about finding that balance.
Okay, so how do we find that balance? What are some practical tips for making those changes happen?
Well, one thing she talks about is this idea of calibration. Basically, it's about adjusting our language to match the context of the conversation and the people we're talking to.
So like reading the room and meeting people where they are.
Yes. She uses this great analogy of improv theater, where the rule is to say yes and. It's about being open to different ideas and building on each other's thoughts rather than shutting things down.
I love that. Collaboration over competition, right?
Exactly. And that's the spirit I think we need to bring to these conversations about language. Not everyone is going to agree on everything, but if we can approach those disagreements with curiosity and respect, I think we can learn a lot from each other.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have so much to think about and so many new tools in my back pocket.
Me too. And that's the beauty of it, right? It's an ongoing journey. Yin really emphasizes approaching this with an open mind and a willingness to learn and grow.
Progress, not perfection. I love that. And speaking of progress, Yin closes the book with this really thought-provoking question. What is one small change you can make today to incorporate more conscious language into your life? It really gets the wheels turning. You know, it's like, okay, what's my next step? And on that note, that section about describing images for accessibility was a big one for me. Like, it's a whole other layer of conscious language.
It's so true. Images aren't neutral either. I really appreciate how Yin points out the importance of alt text for people who use screen readers. It's about making online content accessible to everyone.
And not just throwing any old description in there, right? She gives some solid advice on crafting alt text that really captures the essence of the image.
Exactly. Accessibility is all about being intentional. Even small things, like using high contrast colors on a website, can make a huge difference for some people.
Sometimes it's those little things that make the biggest impact. This whole conversation has really got me thinking differently. And before we wrap up, I did want to circle back to that persuade chapter. It really resonated with me, especially that part about finding those influencers within a group, those folks who can really champion the cause.
Oh, absolutely. Building that coalition of support is key. And I loved how she talked about tailoring your message to resonate with your audience's values.
Right. So instead of just saying, this is the right thing to do, you connect it to things they care about. Like, hey, conscious language can actually make our work more accurate, more respectful, maybe even safer in some cases.
It's about highlighting those benefits, making it relevant to their world.
Totally. Well, this has been such a rich conversation. It feels like we've just scratched the surface, but I feel so much more equipped to actually go out and put all of this into practice.
Me too. And like Yin reminds us, it's a journey, not a sprint. Language is constantly evolving, so we've got to be flexible and stay curious.
It's all about progress over perfection. And speaking of progress, I'm going to leave everyone with that question from Yin's book that's been rattling around in my head. What is one small change you can make today to incorporate more conscious language into your life?
Love that. It's a powerful reminder that even small actions can create a ripple effect.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive into Karen Yin's The Conscious Style Guide. We covered a lot of ground, but I hope you're walking away feeling inspired and empowered. Remember, our words have power. Let's use them wisely. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, keep those conversations going.